Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're going to unpack the monumental federal budget for fiscal year 2026-27. We're cutting straight through the political noise to focus entirely on the data. We've taken thousands of pages of official government documents, economic surveys, and independent policy research and distilled them into a clear, visual story. If you want to understand the real financial trajectory of the country, you are absolutely in the right place. Let's just jump right in. 18.8 trillion rupees. That is the sheer massive scale of the total budget outlay for the coming year. It's a 20% jump over the previous year. Just let that number sink in for a second. When a government plans to spend 18.8 trillion rupees, every single policy choice creates massive ripples across the entire economy, affecting everything from international trade down to the price of your daily groceries. So here's our roadmap for today. We'll look at that massive 18.8 trillion outlay, figure out exactly where all that money is going, break down the new salary tax slabs, tackle the infamous circular debt crisis, and finally, look at the big picture of our economic viability. All right, Section 1, the 18.8 trillion rupee outlay and the macroeconomic framework behind it. The government is trying to pull off a really tricky balancing act here. On one side, they're aiming for an ambitious 4% GDP growth to get investments rolling. But on the flip side, they're heavily banking on a massive 17.6% jump in tax revenues. That's about 15.3 trillion rupees, driven significantly by petroleum levies. It's a tough tightrope walk, right? Trying to spur 4% growth while simultaneously applying contractionary policies that actively pull money out of the market. Now, let's talk about the Maliyati Khasara. That's the fiscal deficit, or primary balance. Just 2 years ago, we were looking at a primary deficit of 0.7% of GDP. Fast forward to now, and that's been flipped to a surplus of 1.6%. That is a 2.3% turnaround relative to GDP. It definitely shows a very aggressive, sustained commitment to tightening the fiscal belt. Moving on to Section 2, where the money goes. Let's look at the expenditure breakdown. Because collecting taxes is only half the story. Where is it all going? Well, it's kind of a financial black hole. Non-developmental expenses are literally swallowing the lion's share of this budget. A whopping 42% goes straight to debt servicing. Then you've got 25% eaten up by civil administration and pensions, and 16% for defense. What does that leave? A measly 12% for the public sector development program. That's the actual infrastructure and productive stuff. And continually slashing that development budget really hamstrings our long-term ability to grow. Let's zoom in on that biggest slice for a second. 8,054 billion rupees. That is the allocation for Qarzan Ki Adaigi, paying off our debt and the interest on it. It is by far the single largest expense, eating up nearly half of the entire outlay. Before a single rupee goes towards a new school, a hospital, or a road, over 8 trillion rupees has to go towards servicing existing debt. Crazy, right? Okay, Section 3, new salary tax slabs and the direct impact on your wallet. Let's bring this down from the trillions to something a bit more relatable, your monthly paycheck. The Finance Bill 2026 actually introduced one of the most significant relief packages for salaried folks we've seen recently. The tax slabs got a massive overhaul. The big news? That 9% income surcharge on high earners is completely abolished. Plus, they've added a new upper limit slab for incomes over 5.6 million rupees. The overall goal here is to lower the direct income tax burden for salary professionals across several brackets. So how exactly do you figure out your exact July 2026 gross pay? It's pretty straightforward. Let's walk through it step by step. Grab your old basic pay from your May 2026 payslip. Now, take your ad hoc relief allowances from 2022 and 2025 and add those in. Those old lines disappear and merge to form your brand new basic pay, the RBPS 2026. Next, calculate 7% of that new basic pay for your 2026 allowance. Finally, take your old conveyance allowance and bump it up by 50%. Put all those pieces together with any frozen allowances and boom, you've got your new gross pay. But there is a pretty huge caveat to all this relief. While direct income taxes on salaries went down, the broader economic strategy relies heavily on indirect taxes and petroleum levies to hit that 15.3 trillion rupee revenue target. As independent researchers point out, leaning this hard on indirect taxation disproportionately squeezes the middle and lower classes. Essentially, it shifts the heavy lifting of this fiscal consolidation onto the shoulders of people who are already teetering near the poverty line. Which brings us to Section 4, the circular debt crisis and power sector pitfalls. You really cannot talk about our economy without tackling the power sector. Try to wrap your head around this number, 4 trillion rupees. According to a recent Institute of Policy Studies report, that is the current size of the energy sector's circular debt. It's an absolutely staggering amount, and it forces these aggressive, constant tariff hikes just to keep basic cash flowing for public and private energy entities. And obviously, those hikes stretch the average consumer's affordability right to the breaking point. But why does this debt just keep spiraling? Well, the IPS study points fingers at a few main culprits. For starters, the system is heavily dependent on expensive imported fuels, which makes it totally vulnerable to dollar parity fluctuations. On top of that, we pay massive capacity charges to thermal independent power producers. And here's the real kicker. The country actually has an installed capacity of over 40,000 megawatts, way above peak demand. But the transmission infrastructure is so obsolete, it can only handle about 23,000 megawatts. Because of that aging grid, state-owned distribution companies suffer over 17% in transmission and distribution losses. It's basically a recipe for disaster. So what's the fix? The IPS study makes it crystal clear. We need immediate structural reform. They're heavily advocating for a fast track toward privatization and deregulating these distribution companies. We also need to develop new business models tailored for renewable energy, prioritize massive investments to modernize our transmission lines, and start setting up public-private partnerships. Basically, we have to inject some real competition and efficiency into a sector that's been monopolized by the state for far too long. And finally, Section 5, debt and economic viability. So we've looked at the budget, the taxes, and the energy crisis. How does this all play out on the global stage? Because domestic budgets don't just exist in a vacuum. The Economic Survey highlights that geopolitical instability, especially in the Middle East, creates severe volatility in global energy markets. And since we rely so heavily on imported petroleum, these external pressures recently drove our import bill up by 6.3% to $8.9 billion US dollars. This kind of regional instability is a huge roadblock because international investors demand geopolitical stability and predictable policies as strict prerequisites before they bring any foreign capital into the country. Which naturally brings us to how international institutions actually judge our economic survival. The Institute of Cost and Management Accountants, or ICMA, uses a debt sustainability framework, which is very similar to what the IMF and World Bank use. It's actually a super simple rule. If the change in your debt to GDP ratio over time is positive, meaning your debt is growing faster than your economy, your debt is unsustainable. Simple as that. If the change is negative, your debt is becoming sustainable. Every single policy in this 18.8 trillion rupee budget basically exists to force that mathematical ratio into the negative. Which leaves us with the ultimate question. Can a budget anchored by 42% debt servicing, a slash development fund, and incredibly heavy indirect taxation actually create a truly sustainable economy? Sure, the fiscal deficit looks better on paper, and there is some real structural relief for salaried workers, but the sheer weight of our historical debt and those glaring energy inefficiencies still loom large. It is a monumental balancing act for sure, and its success over the coming year is going to depend entirely on strict execution and deep systemic reforms. Thanks for joining me on this deep dive today. Keep questioning the data, and I'll see you in the next explainer.